Here on The Colour of Country Life Flow FM, we're speaking with Emma Kealy, the member for Lowan in Melbourne for the sittings of Parliament. How are you, Emma?
Yeah, well, thanks, Ricky.
Now, you've got a bit of excitement out there on the steps of Parliament and protests and the like, but what other business is going on in Parliament, especially on the front of, say, what's happening in our schools?
Yeah, just on that, it is quite bizarre in Melbourne at the moment, Ricky, with the protests that are ongoing in relation to the pandemic bill, which is being debated this week. We've probably got some luxury in being in regional Victoria in that we don't see a lot of protests, but it is relentless and it's constant in Melbourne. There is certainly an enhanced police presence. They've nearly moved into Parliament House, to be honest, at the moment, and the number of protesters really is phenomenal. I've never seen protests like this which have endured for such a long period of time. And while there's been some protesters who've done the wrong thing, the majority of them are trying to air their views that they are deeply concerned around the government's pandemic laws, and they are urging the crossbenchers and the Labor government to reconsider their position and make sure we get this bill withdrawn.
Well, on that front, one of the Western Victorian Upper House MPs, Andy Meddick for the Animal Justice Party, he's one the government seems to have got some amendments that he seems to think are satisfactory to get things over the line. What's your view on what he should be doing for his local community?
Yeah, Andy Meddick, I think, is, he was praising the previous iteration of the pandemic laws, which have now been found to be lacking. He's coming out again celebrating these laws, and it's just very concerning that he doesn't seem to be able to see what the concerns are from people who live within his own electorate. Andy's focus seems to be more a concern about is that people have been very outspoken and some inappropriately. But I wish that Andy would have the same concern for his own constituents when he goes out or endorses home invasion when there are protests on farm of animal activists who are threatening people on their own properties, in their own homes, and yet he is encouraging and sometimes endorsing and participating in exactly those same things. So Andy can't pick and choose what protests he supports depending on what issue it is. You either support that it's okay to step over the line, to go into private people's homes and threaten what they do and their right to earn an income, or you say, no, that's not okay. And I think that Andy should sit back and reflect upon some of the activities that he has actively encouraged and participated in over the past years, because it certainly hasn't been supporting his local constituents. But Andy is one of the few voices who's coming out in support of the amended pandemic laws. It still overlooks what the key concerns are around the pandemic laws. So it doesn't really matter if Andy Meddick thinks that these laws are now fantastic and perfect, because the people who are trained in the legal profession who know a lot more than any politician does about the impacts of laws have come out against it, saying that these pandemic laws should not go ahead in their current form, even with some amendments in play. It's not just, average Joe Blow down the street. We're talking about the Victorian Ombudsman, the President of the Victorian Bar, the Victorian the Law Institute of Victoria, the Victorian Chamber of Commerce. These are highly respected entities who are putting their own reputation on the line and saying that there are simply massive issues still in their pandemic legislation and it should not go through in its current form. I support the views of the people who are highly trained. They know what they're talking about. They have expertise in this area, and if they're saying there are problems with the pandemic laws, then Daniel Andrews must listen and must make significant amendments or withdraw the bill.
Well, Daniel Andrews, I don't know whether he's listening, but Mr Perrottet across the border seems to have got his a little bit cautious about this topic. They're backing away from the idea of extending the powers. So we'll have to watch whether the Andrews government is the only state in Australia that keeps them locked in permanently.
Yes, and that's something that's been argued by the Labor government, that we need to rush through these laws, otherwise we won't be able to manage the pandemic. Well, every other state in Australia has managed to go forward and have a plan going forward to manage the pandemic without having extreme pandemic laws. So why is Victoria different? Why are we rushing this through Parliament? It's likely that this bill will be debated late into the night tonight in the upper house and perhaps into tomorrow. There's talk that we may sit in the Legislative Assembly to debate the bill on Friday to have an additional sitting day, but there is no need. The state of emergency laws do not expire until the 15th of December. Every other state has a different legal strategy going forward to manage the pandemic. It is only Daniel Andrews who is absolutely trying his hardest to push through these pandemic laws, which have been condemned by every single corner of Victoria's legal experts.
Okay, well, as I mentioned earlier, talking about education, I want to track back to something you had to say, and maybe you'll pick it up in Parliament this week about these cuts the Andrews government's made in the education area, supporting students who are perhaps needing a little bit of help.
Yeah, the Advanced program is a specialised government-funded program which really helps kids to re-engage with the school system and to make sure that they don't get lost and perhaps drop out of school, or it's about engaging kids in a different way to bring out their best. The advanced funding means that some schools can participate in the Duke of Ed program, which brings out some fantastic leaders in our community as well. But unfortunately, the government have decided to cut this vital funding after 16 years for Eden Hope, Balmoral and Goroke schools. Now, the reasoning for this funding cut is that they haven't been heavily impacted enough by the COVID pandemic. Now, that may be true in terms of case numbers, but gee, these schools and these kids have really done it hard over the pandemic, particularly in that border zone where they've been cut off from their schools, cut off from their mates, cut off from their sporting abilities. Some of them have been cut off from their regular medical appointments or mental health supports. These kids have done it really, really tough. And so for the government not to understand that, to not understand that, you know what, in regional Victoria, might not have had cases, but we have really struggled under lockdown in the same way that kids in Melbourne, where there's been cases of COVID, have suffered. It is absolutely the wrong time to be cutting any funding program which supports our kids' well-being, that helps keep them in schools. And of course, this comes after the government cut the chaplaincy program in the same schools. So the government have just taken away so much from our rural country schools who need that extra injection of money to make sure they've got the supports in place for their students. But this government seems to be just putting the money into Melbourne. We've seen it over and over, and this will be something that I'll certainly be fighting for, to make sure that funding is reinstated and our kids get the appropriate level of support, even if they live a long way from Melbourne and a long way from the bulk of COVID cases.
Now, Emma, you mentioned border communities. There may be some in South Australia that maybe with a bit of a bone to pick with you, suggesting that people shouldn't spend in regional South Australia because of the way the Marshall government's handled them on the border community front. Are you still holding to that view that people might want to be a bit cagey what they do in South Australia?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm a Victorian MP, and I will always fight to support local businesses. We've got the tourism sector's really struggling in Victoria. There are a lot of small businesses that are doing it tough as well. And, you know, I know that of a lot of people who've really struggled and been treated terribly when they've tried to enter into South Australia. I went to uni in SA. I've got lots of friends over there and family as well, but we need to make sure that we do support our own, support the people that have supported us over COVID, and that unfortunately hasn't been something we've seen from the South Australian government. So the way that our local people can push back is to vote with their feet, send their money where they've had the support, and unfortunately the constant lockouts, and still we're locked out from SA now, even though we've got nearly 90% vaccination rates across the state, and certainly have been well above 95% first vax for all of our border communities for a long time now, and yet we're still not allowed in. So I feel like the government can't pick and choose when they want Victorians' money. You either want to see us as part of a greater unit and treat us with respect, or you don't, and there is a consequence to that.
So I guess if there's a drop in tourism in South Australia, you'd encourage people to direct their concerns to the Premier for the way he's managed the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Mind you, I think there's a lot of South Australians that are happy for us to be locked out, which is fine. But that has consequences. I would like to see that we had much more sensibility around the border management. We've got people who are fully vaccinated. They I know of truck drivers who've had over 300 COVID tests to get back and forth over the border, none of them positive. It has been outrageous, the line that's been drawn down the country between Victoria and South Australia. I've been very frustrated that the Victorian and the South Australian governments would not work together. In fact, they were more often puffing out their chests and proving who was handling the pandemic better. But there was complete ignorance at every step of the way over protecting our border communities and allowing them to go about their lives when they posed absolutely no risk. There are no cases, there was no risk, and yet there was a big push to make sure that kids were locked out of school, people were locked out of their jobs and their businesses, people were restricted from their healthcare appointments. It's been very, very problematic. It's caused an enormous amount of harm and a significant rift that I think will take a long time for many Victorians to forgive what's happened.
Okay, well, back across the border, we've been looking at this issue of the comments that have been released by the Wimmera Emergency Management Team, including Hindmarsh Shire, West Wimmera and Yarra Yambiak, about these virtual relief centres. Now, in effect, what they're saying is that because of their concerns about COVID and people gathering in a fire shelter environment, they want people to register that they'll be part of a virtual emergency relief centre. Does this make sense that you're protecting people from COVID by keeping them in the line of fire?
I think we need to look beyond, the problems that we've had over the past 2 years. The reason that we had lockdowns was originally around buying ourselves time so that we could ensure our hospitals had the PPE that was required, we had enough ICU beds in the state, which still hasn't been delivered in Victoria. We've got very few additional ICU beds to make sure that we had protocols and procedures in place so that we could keep going as much as we possibly can, but our health system wouldn't be overwhelmed. We've had the vaccine rolled out, and over 95% of my electorate has been had at least their first vaccination, and we're certainly heading towards 95% double vax for many of the LGAs in my electorate as well. So we need to look forward and not continue to look back over what has happened, but just accept that, COVID was there, but then we can't use the risk of COVID as an excuse for not providing the support for our local residents in a crisis. When there's a bushfire, our elderly residents who may not have access to a computer will still have an immediate and urgent need to access that emergency support around a relief centre if they need it. And I just think it would be disastrous and a humanitarian disaster if we didn't provide the relief centre support for people who've been burnt out by bushfire, who don't have the ability to keep warm, to get food and water, to contact their family and friends and let them know that they're okay, to make sure that pets are well looked after. To say that you can only access that online is, I think, perhaps not judging the problems that we have in those level of extreme events, and so I would ask those councils to reconsider what they're doing. There may be a place for some services to be online, but it should not ever be at the cost of removing all of our on-site services, because we know most people are fully vaccinated now. There's no reason for relief centres not to be in place.
So you've got the Wimmera Emergency Management Coordinator, John Hutchins, said in this statement not long ago, during an emergency, people who are unwell or have COVID-19 symptoms should isolate from others and wear a face covering and get tested as soon as possible. And if you're in quarantine or isolation due to coronavirus, you can leave your home if you're in an emergency or if your home is unsafe, but try to get back into self-isolation as soon as you safely can. This just sounds to me like maybe they haven't been able to get clarity from the state government about what the COVID rules will be around emergency shelters, so they've had to go for this virtual model.
It just seems like bureaucracy gone mad, to be honest, Ricky. We need to look beyond COVID. We need to not live with fear. It's no longer a pandemic, it is endemic. It's coming, even though in areas of rural and regional Victoria and South Australia we haven't seen cases yet, but it's coming closer. We're going to have to deal with it, but we should never deny people support and care simply because of a virus and it's inevitable that they're going to get anyway. I would urge all government officials, whether they're ministers or whether they're bureaucrats, please see past this and treat people with humanely and with respect, and understand that in a crisis you do not deny people shelter and medical support simply because they might have COVID. That is not what the philosophies or principles should ever be of a fair and caring society.
Well, Emma Kealy, a member for Lowan, thanks for being very generous with your time with us today on Flow. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Ricky.